Okay, welcome to Thoughts and Bolts Show. This is your host, Pedro Laveria. Today, I want to talk a little bit about uh, a conversation Jordan Peterson had with Peter Thiel a few months ago or a few years ago. I listened to it yesterday as I was driving from my house in Kawasaki to Ueno in Tokyo, which is a pretty far drive, about an hour and a half. So, I had time going to and fro to listen to the whole thing. And there were things mentioned that reminded me of ufology. The whole topic they were discussing is this idea why we stop progressing. So there's this idea, this thing people have noticed that this phenomenon that, you know, technology is not uniformly progressing at the same rate. Okay. So, computers, if you compare computers today to computers 80 years ago, I mean, that's night and day, right? 80 years ago, a computer would take up an entire office building and it would take forever for it to just do a single calculation. And nowadays we have computers in our pockets. And the cliche goes that you have more computing power in your cell phone than all of NASA did during the Apollo missions. So, computers have definitely advanced very quickly in 80 years, but other things haven't. So, for example, the Germans 80 years ago developed fighter planes, fighter jets, right? That were, jet engines on fighter planes, right? They were starting to use those at the end of World War II, and 80 years later, we're still using fighter jets. Okay, um, if you go back to the American Civil War, which was roughly 160 years ago, the big technological advancement was the Gatling gun, which is basically this big machine gun that was operated using a turn crank. If you ever saw the movie Last Samurai, that was the one that kind of ended the samurai during their final charge during the Satsuma Rebellion. But 80 years after the Gatling gun, we have the atomic bomb, right? And I hope, I'm not saying we should advance further from that, but my point is that, we're still using jet fighter planes and we're still driving around in cars. Okay. Um, our technology in terms of transportation hasn't progressed at the same rate. Our technology with regards to computers and communications has. Okay. Same thing with medicine, right? We have made advances in modern medicine. Okay. Cancer is much more survivable today than it was 80 years ago, but we haven't eradicated it yet, right? And so there is a sense in which the different technologies aren't progressing at the same rate, and some are progressing faster than others. And the question is why? And the second question is, you know, if there is a why, are we the problem? Are we doing something in our culture to keep that from happening? So Peter Thiel has an interesting theory, and I'm going to connect it to UFOs and ufology and how maybe the UFO mythos is something that can help heal a very specific problem that may be true, a problem that, I mean, he describes in this talk. So let's listen to Peter Thiel.
Doesn't mean it doesn't mean that there's been zero progress. It doesn't mean that the progress we've had has been uniformly good. It doesn't mean that people's fears about the limited progress we have are unjustified either. Maybe all these things are actually part of the explanation for why the stagnation has happened. Now there's a much harder question. And then there's sort of our cultural transformations that one can describe that at least coincided with us and were correlated. How causal they were is always hard to say. But if we sort of think of, the Apollo space program as this last great, technological scientific project, there's some sense where July of 1969, where we landed on the moon, and Woodstock started 3 weeks later. And, with benefit of hindsight, in some sense, that's when progress stopped, scientific technological progress stopped, and the hippies took over the country. And you can describe it in many ways, but in some ways you can describe it as a shift from outer space, from exploring the world outside of us to inner space. And there were sort of all these different transformations. There was and I would describe, yoga, meditation. I would describe, psychedelic drugs. I would describe, I don't know, incels playing video games in basements. There was all this incredible, maybe continued atomization, the navel gazing, of identity politics in a way. You could say that, people often lump, for example, they often lump Marxism and cultural Marxism together. In my telling, these are opposites, because Marxism at least was primarily concerned about the outside objective material economic realities. And then cultural Marxism was like the shift from Apollo to Woodstock, where you just went into the sort of interior world. You no longer were thinking about this outside world, and in some ways, you stopped asking these questions about economic growth and basic economic prosperity, and then that coincided with also with this lack of progress in these things. So I think there were all these kinds of cultural transformations that coincided with this shift.
So yeah, that's really interesting, right? He pinpoints what I find really interesting is that he pinpoints the Apollo landing, right? And then 3 weeks later, Woodstock. It's kind of like, at least, at very least, a symbolic shift, right, in our culture from being, uh, enamored with conquering outer space to conquering inner space, right? In the hippie era, and in the 60s, right? That takes the form of meditation and Zen Buddhism, whatever, and psychedelics. But later on, that morphs into navel gazing about America's sins, and also identity politics, and then even in more recent times to the incel playing video games in his room and not having interest in anything outside the computer screen. Or yeah, I mean, so I think it's very interesting correlation. And it reminds me of a division within ufology between the so-called nuts and bolts camp, right? Which is fundamentally concerned with the craft, right? They want to know how the craft fly, what kind of scientific theories they're 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 validating through a proof of concept, right? Like if the the craft are flying in a way that a warp drive would fly, that means warp drive is possible, right? And so, to what extent can we, replicate that and do what they do? And I don't mean to use Peter Thiel's intonation. I don't mean to mirror him, but um, probably intonation and inflection is the only way I could mirror him if I wanted to, right? But the idea is that, the nuts and bolts people, they just want to know about the craft. What's it made out of? How does it fly? Why? So that we can do the same thing, right? So that we can develop derivative technologies ourselves from that, and make the world better. And then you have the consciousness crowd, right? That it's less concerned about the craft and more concerned about the operators of the craft and how the UFO phenomenon, um, to what extent it is a product of our minds or related to our minds, to what extent consciousness, it affects consciousness, and to what extent consciousness affects it. And it reminds me again, the difference between landing on the moon and taking psychedelics at Woodstock, right? You have nuts and bolts, and then you have the consciousness crowd. And then Thiel argues that the inward turn, at least in the American culture, um, is the cause of technological stagnation, right? Um, and I find that fascinating. And then it makes me wonder, um, how that relates to ufology, right? If we take a consciousness only approach or just focus only on consciousness, does that also impede our understanding of the UFO phenomenon? It seems to me the opposite is true, right? But but also remember ufology is has until 2017 has been like the a subculture within a subculture within a subculture. And before 2017, at least in mainstream culture, has always been thought it was kind of kooky. I was one of those people that thought it was kooky, that was kooky and kind of dumb until I got red pilled on the UFO phenomenon. Um, but so that does so it's possible that what's true for society as a whole isn't true for ufology. But it's also possible that what's true for society as a whole is true for ufology. So it's possible that this kind of like turn to consciousness may impede our understanding of the UFO phenomenon. And if that's true, is that purposeful on the part of the UFO phenomenon itself, or is it purposeful on the part of the state that's kind of psyoping us and trying to get us uninterested? That's one question I have, or one set of questions I have. Um, but then there's another part of me that wonders that what if Peter Thiel is right? Okay, that um, we sacrifice conquering outer space so that we can, uh, you know, conquer inner space. So rather than being focused on what's in the stars and colonizing the stars and, expanding humanity's reach and presence and survival potential, we turned inward um, in order to deal with our issues. Um, if that's true, could the UFO mythos save us from that, right? Because as I contend on this show and have contended on Twitter, um, thoughts and bolts is where it's at. Okay. You need the nuts and bolts study of UFO. You need chemistry. You need physics. Okay. And you do need the consciousness aspect. Okay. You need parapsychology. Okay. You do need psychology and you do need all the humanities, really, the study of religion and all that sort of thing, art. Um, you do need the humanities part of it too. The consciousness part of it is just as important as nuts and bolts. And I don't think one part is more important than the other. That's why Tom DeLonge was kind of genius when he did To the Stars, right? To the Stars of Academy of Arts and Science, right? You have to approach this thing uh, trying to understand it, you know, using Schopenhauer's language in terms of will and representation, right? For Kantians, phenomenon and noumenon, right? The inner and the outer, okay, the physical and the mental. Um, and what if the UFO phenomenon is trying to teach us that? Because remember, you go back to at least the 1950s, right? Let's start at the 1950s. George Adamski and Desmond Leslie come out with that book, Flying Saucers Have Landed. And if you go back to the 1950s contactees, right? They all have their stories have a thoughts and bolts dimension, right? There are very physical metallic craft, okay, that they say uh, flies according to some kind of magnetic principle, some form of magnetism, right? Electrogravitics, whatever. Okay, so there's a very technological side to their experience. But then also, if you go back to Adamski, right, he says that the aliens talk to him telepathically. So there's the consciousness aspect. There's the parapsychological there. Okay. So if you look at from George Adamski all the way to the modern times, okay, forget the 1950s contactees are problematic. I know that. But if you go to the close encounter phenomenon with the UFO abductees, again, it's thoughts and bolts. There's very physical craft using a technology we aren't familiar with, and there's telepathy involved, and all these sorts of mental phenomenon to the 90s with, the whole contact movement, the CE5 thing with Greer, to even today when we're talking about, Skywatcher and, psionic assets and everything. There's physical things in the air flying that they are recording, but also, you know, they're they're drawing them in somehow with psychics, for lack of a better word. They call them psionic assets, right? They're always you'll see this with remote viewing too. There's always this discomfort with the paranormal, right? So we need terms like psionic asset. In the Soviet Union, they used psychotronics, right? Because they were hardcore materialists, thanks to Lenin. Um, so is it possible that we don't have to sacrifice the conquest of outer space in order to conquer inner space? And is it possible that we don't need to sacrifice the conquest of inner space in order to conquer outer space? Is it possible to do both at the same time? And maybe just as nuts and bolts in consciousness with regards to the UFO phenomenon is a false dichotomy, and we should start thinking in terms of thoughts and bolts, maybe we should stop thinking of terms of outer space and inner space and just think in terms of space, right? It's the space that's subjective and the space that's objective. But maybe we should stop thinking of the conquest of the two as separate endeavors, right? Um, I don't know. What do you think? Tell me in the comments. Like and subscribe. Okay, like and subscribe. But I think Teal might be right in his pinpointing that, Apollo landing event, and 3 weeks later you have Woodstock, which was a very, very real event in American culture and by extension, Western civ, and how they happen 3 weeks from each other, right? And it seems like, we go to the moon, but after the Apollo missions, we don't go back, and then we don't go to Mars yet. Um, but we got psychedelics, we have meditation, we have incels playing video games, right? This turn inward. Um, and maybe what the UFO phenomenon is trying to tell us is that we need to balance the two, or or that we can do both equally well, and that maybe in balancing the two, we keep both sides in check, right? So if we focus too much on outer space, maybe, our weapons technology becomes too destructive when we cease existing. But if we focus too much on inner space, maybe we never leave this planet, and then our fate is tied to it, no matter what happens to it. And that's bad too, right? Um, I certainly don't want to be like that monk, and I think it was the movie Deep Impact, as the big tidal wave is coming and he's ringing the bell in his temple, right? Claiming the Dharma. I don't want to be that guy. I want to be the monk that's on the spaceship, right? Avoiding the big tidal wave, right? And maybe that's what the UFO phenomenon is trying to tell us, that we can conquer outer space and we can conquer inner space. And if you don't like the word conquer, we can extend our reach, okay, into outer space and into inner space at the same time. And maybe in order to do either of those well and responsibly, we need to do both at the same time. Maybe since the 1950s, with the 1950s contactees, right, like George Adamski, who again talked about nuts and bolts craft in conjunction with telepathic pilots. Maybe that's what the UFO phenomenon is trying to tell us in the age of nuclear weapons. Maybe. So remember, consciousness is not classified, but neither is outer space. So maybe you should learn how to meditate, and you should also learn how to use a telescope. And with that, I bid you good night.